Thank you so much, Mariah. People hear me back there?
Yes.
That was an introduction that my mother would believe and my wife wished was true. When I was first invited, I want to thank Maria for asking me to present here today at Science Boot Camp. I was a little bit skeptical, and then she said the theme was disaster. And I thought, I know a little bit about that, so that would be kind of a challenge in a different audience. And I also have compassion for disaster survivors, not victims, by the way, and also for first responders and first receivers, people at hospitals who treat and respond to disasters as well. And finally, when Maria said that this was a courteous audience, that was the closer for me. Just like most kids in America, maybe a little different, I wanted to be a firefighter researcher when I grew up. And have learned a lot from the fire service and how they deal with ongoing emergencies over decades of their career. Certainly want to acknowledge the support of NIOSH, CDC, also FEMA, and the Health Resources Service Administration, and also closer to home, the Department of Health Services, the Northwest Center for Public Health Practice, School of Public Health, and my home department, Psychosocial and Community Health, where I spent the last 37 years. Observation. Observation is such an important component of science. And fortunately, with technology now, we have real-time photos and even videos of disasters. And I think we can learn a great deal from watching how people respond, their behaviors during a disaster. Maybe also just a word about what do I mean by disaster in terms of definition. Has disaster been defined at this point? Up to this point, anyone? Kind of. It's difficult. I think one definition is that it is community-wide devastation that causes property damage and also casualties, that is, human casualties. By that definition, though, a cyber attack would not qualify as a disaster. But I think you'd have to talk to an IT person, they might beg to differ. And also, one of the videos that I'm going to show, because there was no property damage, might not also qualify. And I'm referring to the terrorist nerve gas attack on the Tokyo subway system in 1995. How many of you remember that in the media? Oh, great, majority of you? Okay. It was completely unexpected. One of our research fellows, Ken Taneda, who I had an opportunity to get to know and to work with on some of this research, was actually the senior resident at one of the receiving hospitals in Tokyo when this disaster occurred. And just to set this up, they were doing a nursing video, an educational video, to show kind of a day in the life of a nurse at one of the hospitals in Tokyo. And pretty soon people started arriving at the hospital. And they were rubbing their eyes, they were having difficulty breathing. And actually, the first person that arrived, Dr. Taneda, she was unconscious, and took her into one of the back rooms on a gurney, and she died. And this was so shocking to him, and he had no idea what was going on. So just go back just a little bit, and what happened, there was a doomsday cult that felt that doomsday wasn't coming along fast enough for them, so they decided to speed up the process by concocting and fabricating sarin gas, one of the more toxic substances that we know of. A drop of this, maybe the size of a dime on your skin, even if it was relatively dilute, would almost certainly be fatal. So this group of really not highly educated, but I think they had one biochemist was able to fabricate the sarin gas covertly over a period of a few days. Fortunately, they didn't spend much time. It was relatively dilute. And then their delivery device was interesting. They put this sarin gas in baggies and put it in lunch buckets and walked onto the Tokyo subway system with it. And then they put these baggies all around the subway system at the same time, rush hour. And their detonation device was kind of interesting. They were carrying umbrellas. And they took their umbrellas and used the tip to poke into the baggies, and the sarin gas spilled out. And it was so powerful, even though it was relatively cold and damp there and it wasn't very volatile, that it made 5,000 people go to the hospital. 12 of them died. And it obviously made the news around the world. When I talked to Dr. Taneda about this, he was completely baffled. He had no idea that Tokyo would be subjected to this kind of a terrorist attack. It just made no sense to him whatsoever. So what I'd like to ask you to do is, you see this tape that was being filmed. How about the half from about here over? I'd like you to imagine that you're one of the subway survivors of this sarin gas attack. And you're just maybe on your way to work in the morning, and all of a sudden your eyes start burning. And then you're having a difficulty breathing and catching your breath. And then maybe you're a little bit tremulous. And then you look around you and everyone is showing the same kinds of symptoms and coughing. And from here over, I'd like you to imagine that you're a first receiver. You'll see a number of nurses responding to this disaster at the hospital. And think of how you would feel and think as well. Remember, at this time, this particular agent was unidentified, and we'll talk a little bit after the video of how they came to identify it. You'll have to bear with me. The quality of this and launching it might be a little bit difficult. That's not an ambulance, by the way, that's a bus. Medical director. We're so interested in this particular disaster that we actually wrote about lessons learned and published an article in 2005 in the Journal of Traumatology about what we could learn from this disaster. But going back to my role-playing here, about all of the victims, survivors of the sarin gas attack, what would you be thinking and feeling?
Frightened.
Frightened? Okay.
Confused.
How's that?
Confused.
Confused? Sure.
Panicked.
Panicked. Interesting that you mentioned that word. Did you actually see anyone in there that looked panicked? This is one of the myths of disasters. The only place you see widespread disasters, panic in disasters is in Hollywood movies. Or there is one situation if there is an immediate disaster hazard and there's lack of egress. So you're trapped in a burning building. Then you might see panic. But panic is really very rare. What are some other thoughts about what a disaster survivor like this of a terrorist attack? Yes?
You want to figure out what's happening.
What's happening? Yes.
And how to fix it.
What is this? What's going on? It was almost 3 hours after this attack that they first learned that this was likely sarin gas. And how they learned about it is a public health physician was watching this unfold on television. And he said, oh, this is the same thing that happened a year ago in a suburban community, which it was, same terrorist cult. And the interesting thing is then he called the police department. The police department held a news conference and announced that it was sarin gas, and someone at the hospital was watching this news conference, and that's how they learned about it. So another definition of a disaster is that the response system is overwhelmed. And part of the response system is communication. And usually that's one of the first casualties of a disaster. And in fact, certainly remember the 9/11 attacks? At the Pentagon, one of the ways that they were able to pass along information, because all the emergency channels were overwhelmed with traffic, was to write a little message on a piece of paper and have runners run around at the Pentagon. That's communication breakdown. How about the first receivers over here? What are you thinking as these patients, busloads, are unloading?
Well, you want to know what it is.
What it is, of course, what it is. Did any of you notice lack of universal precautions?
Yes.
Yeah.
Is it contagious, or is it something that's going to contaminate me? The answer to that is yes. In fact, a number of the first receivers were sickened slightly because it was such a dilute sample by touching them. And I don't know if you saw that one individual was carrying a purse that was covered with sarin gas. So that was one of the lessons learned. Universal precautions. You don't know what you're dealing with. One of the things that we found in this article too is that our ability to treat those who are traumatized in disasters like this, turns out that a small percentage experience post-traumatic stress disorder, and we'll define that. But we don't have really very good treatments. For maybe a quarter of people with PTSD, they develop chronic PTSD despite every effort, including medications. So that's one area where there has not been very much progress, I must say, even up until 2014. Any other questions or comments about this unusual type of disaster? Most disasters are natural disasters. Human-caused disasters like this, a terrorist attack, outliers, very rare. So what we need to do is really have an all-hazards approach to disasters. If we're preparing for a natural disaster, like an earthquake in this area, we're going to be about 85% prepared for something like a terrorist attack like this. So some objectives today. I want to talk about barriers to doing good scientific investigations of disaster behavioral health. Talk about some possible solutions, partial solutions, and ways to mitigate these barriers. To talk about some topical trends in disaster behavioral health, and also talk about roles of technology in supporting this kind of research and training. Why behavioral health? Why not disaster emotional health? disaster mental health. You know, behaviors are probably the most important thing to consider, especially during the impact phase of a disaster. Thoughts and feelings, while not unimportant, probably are not as important. And also, pre-disaster preparedness is probably a key. And I think it's the most important phase of a disaster and is often overlooked. In those at risk, who's at risk? Can I see everyone showing their hand? So since you're all at risk, how many of you, let's be honest now, have disaster kits at home? First aid kits? Okay, well, more than average. How many of you have a disaster plan? Fewer. How many of you have actually rehearsed your disaster plan? Huh. You know, this is a problem. This is a problem. Actually, in Florida, there had been a series of hurricanes in 2004. And after 2 of these hurricanes, they did a survey and asked how many people had disaster kits and disaster preparedness available in their own residence. And it was less than half. It was about 40%. This was after 2 hurricanes. So kind of go figure. I think that we have a lot of denial going on when it comes to this. It'll never happen or it won't happen in my lifetime. We don't know. We just don't know. We always need to be prepared. Also, diagnosable mental disorders are relatively rare in disaster survivors. And when I say rare, it's a single digit or maybe low double digit percentage of individuals suffer from either depression, which is the most common response in disaster, or post-traumatic stress disorder. But that means that 80 or 90% of people are resilient and don't develop mental disorders. So the first barrier is that disaster behavioral health is really a young science. If we discount our understanding and research on war casualties, which goes back to World War I, really, where they had shell shock, and World War II, and after the Vietnam War. Post-traumatic stress disorder was not really a diagnosable disorder until 1980. So it probably existed before then, but was not recognized by DSM, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, until 1980. So it's a relatively young science, maybe going back 20 or 30 years. We've drawn on what we've learned from military disasters, for instance, but studies of civilian disasters relatively new. So our practice partners, those who could help us with our research, really knew very little about this. So one of the approaches that we took was to develop an online training. And with funding from the Washington State Department of Health, we put together a 1-hour online training. And by the way, all the references, the websites are going to be available on the web page for the conference so that you can go to that after my presentation today. And if you're interested in taking this particular course on disaster behavioral health, which focuses on terminology and pretty much the basics, it's accredited by the CDC. And when I first put this training together, I was a little skeptical. I'd really never done an online course to that point. And I became convinced of the efficacy and the worth of this when 1,000 students took this course and completed the training. And just thinking of the outreach, it was really quite successful in that way. So, first responders and their organizations are insular, and they're really not that open to research. So one approach that I took is to learn their language. I actually received training as an EMT, which taught me that I'm not a very good EMT. I think that I like to mull things over for about a month And as a PhD, I wasn't used to making important decisions in 5 seconds. In fact, I really came to wonder if PhDs make important decisions at all. But I learned to respect their customs and traditions. And firefighters are very reluctant to engage in change. Things have worked for them for hundreds of years. Why do we want to come in and change things for them? And so, for instance, the New York City firefighters wore leather helmets until the 1980s. They were reluctant to try on these newfangled helmets. They were reluctant to have the self-contained breathing apparatus that they now use routinely. They had leather lungs, and they were kind of proud of it. That's resulted in a drastic decline in on-the-job fatalities and mortality in firefighters, probably 80% reduction since their introduction. But they were very reluctant at first. Go natives spend some time in their villages. As an EMT, they allowed me to sit in the back of the medic unit and hold the saline bottle. I'll never be one of them. I have to recognize that, but they'll respect you for trying and trying to understand more about them. This is from a disaster exercise in Portland. This was called Top Off 4. Top Off was top officials, so that they would have a disaster scenario rolled out. And for some reason, the Department of Homeland Security loved dirty bombs, or just a regular explosive device with radioactivity wrapped around it. And this was an example, and I'm standing in front of one of the decontamination tents, which, by the way, was too close to the entrance to the Oregon State University Hospital. It was about 20 feet away. So if someone is worried, and what they're going to do is they're going to go right through the door of the hospital, and then it's shut down because it's contaminated. So I always learned something in a disaster. One of the things they had projections, weather projections, and where the plume would go. And one of the things that they found is that it went over the linen suppliers for the hospitals, the plume. And guess what that did? Shut down the hospital. They didn't have their linen supply. So think of hospitals as pretty fragile, really, and that we can't probably treat everyone in a disaster in a hospital setting. People wonder what Jaffa is. That was something that I tried to avoid at all costs. Being labeled just another freaking academic. So this next disaster will kind of speak for itself. It might take a little while to load here.
Across northern Japan, they felt it.
Oh.
A violent magnitude 9.0 earthquake on March 11, 2011.
We had this problem
It
before.
was centered about 80 miles offshore, and tsunami.
Try this.
The incredible footage was captured.
Huh.
In Sonoma, people retreated to a high-rise rooftop.
So those are survivors.
Watching horror as
It's interesting. Came in here yesterday to prepare. It ran fine.
knocking buildings into rubble and mixing into a kind of tsunami stew filled with vehicles, building parts and contents. Seawater cascaded over seawall.
Mentioning that was an 18-foot seawall. Tsunami went right over the top of it. Yeah, if you've got magic touch.
This video shows the northern Japan that they felt. A violent magnitude 9.0 earthquake
Yeah.
on March 11, 2011. It was centered.
Give it a little more time to load. Progress bar.
About 80 miles offshore, and tsunami warning went up immediately
Open it up outside, yeah.
in coastal city. These people filled with vehicles, building parts and kind.
Do you have the video saved on the drive outside of PowerPoint?
No.
No.
Is it coming straight from the web?
I think it's embedded in the PowerPoint.
Yeah. Well, the link is probably. And that's why the video is going over the web.
Is it fully defined?
Hmm.
I still let me know that.
Yeah. Why don't we stop here? I think what you were able to observe is the individuals in this coastal city actually all retreated to the top of a tall building, which was able to withstand the tsunami forces. This also points out that this was not panic. If we think of panic as just kind of running randomly and bumping into one another, that didn't happen. In fact, they were helping one another. You see that? Pulling each other up onto the building. And in the attacks on the World Trade Center, you know that there was a massive evacuation after the first building was struck. How many, or what percentage of individuals do you think were able to successfully evacuate prior to the collapse of the second World Trade Center tower? Any ideas? 10%? 50? 85%, actually. One of the reasons for this, they'd actually practiced. They'd had drills, evacuation drills. So it turns out that it made quite a difference. And you talk about vulnerable populations. In this particular disaster, it was temps who had not taken part in the prior evacuation drills. But the altruism that occurred during this was remarkable. Some of the individuals were in wheelchairs. The elevators were shut down. So actually, some of their coworkers would grab them and help them down in elevators, down the stairs, out into the lobby. And I think obviously for those who were going up, like the firefighters, it was disastrous. But for those who were trying to evacuate, it was very successful. And again, it was not widespread panic. So disaster impacts and disaster management is incredibly complex, dynamic. And really, I think this is one of the things that Mariah asked me about was, is it cross-disciplinary? It really has to be. I think this is one of my OMG slides, and you have the handout with that. And this was published a few years back. And what it points out is that disaster planning and preparedness occurs at a number of levels that are nested within one another. So there's the individual family level. Outside of that is the workplace, the community, the state. Let's not forget about the tribes. Then the federal level, and even the global level. Also planning. Planning is so important. I think there was a famous general from World War II that said that war planning is so important, and then war breaks out. Dwight Eisenhower, I was so impressed with his statement about planning. He said that plans are worthless but the planning process is invaluable. There's also a quote, probably the smartest thing that an infamous rapist ever said, Mike Tyson. Says, everyone has a game plan until they're punched in the mouth. So that was a good one. So disaster planning occurs at every level. Disaster preparedness occurs at every level. Then you have the impact. There are logistical challenges. Actually, for some disasters, the logistics are not as bad as others. Think of a tsunami. Probably goes inland, maybe 100 yards, maybe a few miles, but the rest of the countryside is protected, and so they can provide support. On the other hand, a Hurricane Katrina that wipes out most of the South is much more difficult in terms of logistics, as you might imagine. By the way, some of my very dear colleagues responded to Katrina, and they said the communication was impossible. Supposedly the internet was going to stand up to a nuclear attack. There was no nuclear attack, and there was no internet connectivity. In fact, they would have to stand someplace outside with a satellite phone and maybe have 15 minutes to communicate with the outside world. Also, flexibility is very important. You have your plans, but I think there was a public health physician responding to the SARS attack in Toronto who was talking with his emergency manager about the plan, and he says, the emergency manager said, we have to stick with the plan, we have to stick with the plan. And he said, the plan is going to take us over the side of a cliff. We have to back off, we have to reconsider. So flexibility is also key. Then, most individuals are disaster responders in this community. They love that first surge and the adrenaline, and then they get kind of bored. And to me, it seems that the most important part of a disaster is the recovery. Now, this might be years down the road. Has New Orleans completely recovered from Katrina? Yeah. In that disaster behavioral health online course, this is one of the things that I talk about are the psychosocial phases of a disaster. For some disasters, there is a pre-disaster warning or a threat. For example, you can see a hurricane. Now from satellite photos, you can see it coming. You have a pretty good idea where landfall is going to be. It was interesting, Hurricane Camille, way back, I think it was in the 1920s or 1930s, before, obviously, satellites. They used to have hurricane parties. I read about one survivor, after the party, woke up in a tree. I think about 3 miles from where they were having their party. They had no idea. So if you have some warning, you can evacuate, for instance, which presents some challenges. Then there's disaster impact, and then there's the heroic stage. And most of the heroes of disasters are, in fact, civilians. They're citizens helping other citizens. Then there's the honeymoon phase. Very interesting to see tapes of individuals following disaster. Sometimes they're laughing and smiling. Many of them are just happy to be alive. And the honeymoon phase lasts about as long as honeymoon. And then there's the disillusionment. Red Cross leaves town, FEMA leaves town, and you're left with working through the grief, the loss, the hardship. There's so much focus on the disaster impact and event, but we have to think after the event, there's hardship, living in a shelter, there are losses. What if it wiped out your place of employment? These make it very difficult for people to recover. Might take years, and then reconstruction and a new beginning. So as I said, it's imperative to partner and collaborate across health science disciplines, professions, and beyond. For example, the ecological model paper I co-authored with an Air Force colonel, nurses, a public health physician, a pharmacist, and a social worker. So we kind of put our discipline knowledge together and we're able to develop this model. One of the studies that I did with a fire department, I was able to invite and encourage the police chief to be a co-author on the paper. So we'll see how this one works. So this is a destructive tornado, and it's actually, there's tornado watchers who are filming this. That tornado vortex was about a mile in diameter.
Oh gosh, there's a monster tornado. Okay, back up. Look at that. Yeah, I don't know what
This is what's left of downtown Joplin.
Dude, the trees are debarked. Scott.
I'm not going to run this one. But that particular tornado was the most costly tornado in history. Over $2 billion, nearly $3 billion worth of property loss. It killed over 150 people, over 1,000 people were injured. And I think Joplin did a pretty good job of recovering and bouncing back. But they still have some challenges, even though that was in 2011. How many of you remember the West Texas fertilizer plant explosion? Yeah, that was actually just last year. Let's see what we can do with this video here. So this is broken into frames, and this is a resident of West Texas who sees the fire at the fertilizer plant. Idea. As you remember that actually some of the fatalities, and I believe there were about 15 fatalities, were volunteer firefighters. So actually there was a professional firefighter who was driving by. He was a captain. He went out to help, and they were fighting the fire just before the explosion. And they said to the captain, who's now deceased, that we don't know what we're doing. And I think a few moments after that, this ammonium nitrate exploded. They don't know the cause of the initial fire, although this particular fertilizer plant had been actually fined for some violations before. But the last time OSHA investigated and actually had an on-site tour of that particular facility was 1985. So we produce a lot of toxic and explosive chemicals in this country. I think 70,000 toxic chemicals. Actually, this one we monitor and know that it's very dangerous. Besides the 15 fatalities, there were over 50 serious injuries, including burn injuries. I think a 50-unit apartment building was destroyed, dozens of homes. So it certainly qualifies as a disaster. First one was a natural disaster. The second one was a human-caused disaster. Kind of difficult to compare and contrast. We think that human-caused disasters might have more of a psychosocial impact. The way to think about this is that there are intentional and unintentional human-caused and natural disasters. Intentional would be the terrorist act if they're human-caused, or there can be accidents that are unintentional, such as this fertilizer plant explosion. And then there can't be intentional natural disasters unless we're talking about an act of God. And then we have unintentional natural disasters. It's quite a long list here. There are also silent disasters, biological. Actually, probably the biggest disaster in human history was a natural biological disaster, the Great Pandemic. In World War I, 9 million lost their lives in combat and related causes. 50 million people died in the Great Pandemic. In fact, they calculated that about 5% of the human population died 1918, 1919. It can be big. Chemical and radiologic. They're particularly frightening because in many cases not only can you not hear them, you cannot see them, you cannot sense them at all. So one way to try to compare disasters is to maybe look at just biological and chemical. And we did a review paper on what we know in terms of how people respond. Another way to look at this is to look at outcomes of disasters and do a meta-analysis. And we used to think that people would either have major depression or post-traumatic stress disorder. And let me define that. This would be an event that is perhaps injurious or life-threatening, and then you can't get it out of your mind. You don't want to think about it, but it keeps intruding, maybe even affecting your sleep. And it also is something that you want to avoid. You want to stay away from reminders. And it also has health effects. Post-traumatic stress disorder is associated with immunosuppression, with increased risk of cardiovascular disease. So it's not merely mental, cognitive, behavioral, but also physical. But they found that individuals who had PTSD, majority of them also were depressed. So over 50%. So they're not mutually exclusive by any means. Another challenge is that the core disaster behavioral research community is far and few between. One of the things we did is to host a web-based training and a team building. And this is also at the Northwest Center for Public Health Practice. So we were able to work with individuals from all over the United States. And the supporting agency for this, by the way, was the University of Oklahoma and their disaster lab. And there's the paper that we talked about, our experience. Also, the standard clinical mental health model is completely inappropriate for disaster responders or survivors. This shows the prevalence of post-traumatic stress disorder in first responders and other samples. And you can see that probably in a community-based sample, maybe 2% or so have PTSD. Crime victims, maybe close to 5%. Urban firefighters and paramedics, up to 20%. Actually, that was some research that we published. But you can see that actually the vast majority of disaster survivors, even combat survivors, do not experience case definition of post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, some individuals experience what's called partial PTSD or subsyndromal PTSD. So they have some of the symptoms, but they don't meet the case definition. But I like what Betty Pfefferbaum said about these individuals. She said, it's not as if they're not suffering. So I think what we need to do is focus on preserving and augmenting resilience, and also something called post-traumatic growth. So a fraction of individuals, at least 10%, I think greater, after a disaster actually say that they're better off in some ways. My clinical practice, I treat individuals who've survived their own personal disasters, emergencies. And to hear one individual with just such a serious head injury, it was a sports-related injury, that he was going to have a difficult time ever graduating from college, although he was really trying. And he said that I'm so much better off as a result of my traumatic brain injury. And it was he was very serious. And those individuals who can find the silver lining in whatever disaster do far better than those who, like another patient of mine said, nothing good came out of this, nothing good. So a few years ago, I mounted a training for the Everett Fire Department. I think there are 130 individuals that came for individualized trainings. That was a time when I thought online training would really be a good idea. But what I was able to do is focus on their career. So resilience training, you need to look at the population. And for this group, one of the things I focused on, for example, was sleep hygiene, because their biggest complaint is not traumatic incidents, it's lack of sleep. Disasters occur without warning, sometimes in seconds. So how do you prepare and submit a grant, get funding, get human subjects approval? There actually are some rapid grants now that you can apply through NIH, but here we're talking maybe 2 or 3 months before funding is possible. So one of the things that I did is said, well, how about if I study simulations? How about drills, exercises, tabletops, training outcomes? Anyone recognize where this disaster occurred? See the Smith Tower in the background there? I'm sure this was Top Off 2, right off I-5. This was in 2004. And that bus there that looks like it was blown over, they blew it over. And this was also in that same disaster. And this was a disaster at the medical center nearby here. That's one of my students. And she was able to bring the triage and screening of these disaster victims to a complete standstill by doing something pretty simple. Does anyone have any idea what she did to throw a monkey wrench into the screening? She's from California, it's a hint. She spoke Spanish. And they said, now, just tell us what's happened to you. Don't speak it. They finally got someone from housekeeping to serve as a translator, but they really were not qualified to serve in that role. This was in 2004. The second most common language in the United States. We also looked at a disaster drill, and this was providing antibiotics, Cipro, to individuals who had supposedly been exposed to anthrax. And then we also looked at the outcomes of training for domestic preparedness. And this was interesting. This was something that the Department of Defense was doing, going around to all the major metropolitan fire districts in the United States. Tacoma Fire Department was Department 100. And I said, well, I'd like to find out if this is causing benefits, making firefighters more prepared, more confident. And an individual from the Department of Defense said, well, let's know how that comes out. I think they spent $50 million on this and didn't have an evaluation component. So I thought, I really had some pretty good news. Firefighters who received this domestic preparedness training, 4 months later, they were significantly more confident in their ability, in this particular case, to respond to a nuclear terrorist attack. But if you look at the numbers over there, 100 would be completely confident, 50 would be somewhat. 0 would be not confident at all, so they went from 14 to 18. And we also had a tabletop exercise where we had all of the major players on campus here at the University of Washington. And we simulated basically an influenza outbreak and how it would affect the campus. So some current trends. I'll just touch on these. Long-term recovery, interventions and outcomes, vulnerable population, which would include children, for example. How about the homeless? When you're instructed to shelter in place, and you're homeless. I think immigrant populations, not English speaking. And also, I might mention a study of community resilience. One of the things that we've come to look at is post-traumatic stress disorder. If it lasts for more than 1.5 or 2 years, it's probably permanent. So I heard the director of the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health talk about research that they've done in Manhattan in the vicinity of the 9/11 attacks. They said at 6 months, 8% of the population had PTSD. 6 years, 8% had PTSD. And they're almost all the same people. And it wasn't delayed onset PTSD. That's very rare. Also, there's a study of this was a fireworks plant explosion that was devastating. And this was in the Netherlands. And they found that if individuals had PTSD at 2 years, 10 years, they still had PTSD. Another vulnerable population, American Indians. And what I was able to do with this particular presentation a few years ago for the Consortium of Tribes in the Northwest is talk about psychological first aid for this particular population, which is a brief intervention. It's modular and can be offered in the first week or so, and public health personnel, emergency workers can provide this training. And it can be used in a variety of settings like shelters, for instance. So some of the basic principles: expect a normal recovery, that people are resilient, recognize and build on their strengths. And there are a number of modular components, like for some individuals, relaxation might be important. Safety is a key. In families, we know very little about the impact of disasters on children. Some of the research is suggesting that they might be as resilient as adults, that is, that only a small fraction of them experience mental disorders. But we haven't done, I think, enough research to be sure of that. Finally, I'd like to mention a program that's quite innovative that's going on at the University of Ottawa in some surrounding communities. And it's designed to enhance community resilience. And in the first instance, they bring people together and introduce them and talk about the goals of the research. So I think that this, in the first case, is a good idea. A disaster is not a good place to exchange business cards. The second phase, they have them complete a template on a Google Doc. And it would talk about what resources they can bring to bear. So the Red Cross, for example, can say, this is what I can bring to a disaster. And maybe the railroad can say, this is what I can bring. And so they fill out this template, and they come back for the third phase, and they have a disaster tabletop scenario. So I think there are certain communities that seem to be more resilient than others in the face of disaster. Can we actually build resilience in communities? I think this is one of the first approaches and programs, I think, that's designed to test that. And finally, I'm available to answer your questions. And your first question is, yes, it is worth two in the bush. Yes.
Do you ever conduct unannounced major drills? And the reason I ask that is because after the Nisqually earthquake, some of the people who were trained to to be, you know, our floor monitors and things like that, really went into kind of a shock mode and were very unresponsive. And so you ever test people to see how they're actually going to respond in a disaster?
No, it's a good idea. I think that most of the research that I've been involved with has involved disasters that were planned well in advance, or disaster simulations, I should say. But I think there is that aspect to most disasters, is that they don't necessarily happen on cue. So, but I think that that's a good point. But I think we know very little about that. I think, for one thing, in doing that kind of research, you know, again, is it ethical?
Yeah.
So, what other questions? Yes.
You talked about communities being resilient. I wonder if there's any research been done on, like in Oklahoma, where I'm from, with all of, every year we talk about tornadoes and now even some small earthquakes. I wonder if the constant pressure of being prepared helps also.
You know, I think in the aftermath of a disaster, the immediate aftermath, there's kind of teachable moments where people will think after a tornado or some disaster, an earthquake. After the Nisqually earthquake, people were all into earthquake preparedness. Now that's 10 years ago, I think 15 years ago, so people have lost interest. I would think that, I mentioned the research that had been done in Florida, where they'd already had 2 hurricanes, and only 45% of the people had a disaster kit or disaster plan. So I think it would help. I think it increases the numbers, and you know, I think communities do come together very often after a disaster, and which would make sense. But I don't know if it's been systematically looked at. I think that there may be certain communities that have resources and are better off, that do better in the aftermath of the disasters, than others where the resource poor. Other questions? Yes.
You mentioned the Google Doc where people
Yes.
describe what they were doing. How common is it for individual institutions or whatever to have their plan kind of without considering what everyone else is doing? I'm thinking of the one semi-disaster I was involved in. There was a huge flood where we lived.
Yes.
First people on scene were the RSPCA, the Animal Society with pet food.
Mm-hmm.
Probably wasn't what people were really looking for.
Yes.
And then they blocked up all the loading base for everything else.
Now, one of the things about the Top Off disaster series was designed to bring together all of these agencies to help them to get on the same page, because I think that's often a problem. Is, I think they call it silos, so they're all separate and have their own plans. And I know that I helped to put together the plan for the University of Washington School of Nursing in the T Wing nearby. And it was supposed to be coordinated with the overall medical school, which was supposed to be coordinated with the university plan. But I think it seems like very often these plans are developed without that kind of cross-discipline and cross, I guess, agency or department kind of collaboration. So I think that's a problem. I think Top Off tried to address that. I think in Top Off 4, I think there are over 100 agencies. Other questions? Yes.
Sorry. So after, so say there was a biological disaster or even a natural disaster in an area, is the federal government agencies, so like the CDC or FEMA, do they just respond, or must they be invited in by local government?
Well, it's a federal asset. It has to be a presidential declaration. And so generally that will mean that the governor will have to ask for aid. But the idea is that all disasters are local, so that there is first a local response. If that is sufficient, then the CDC is not needed and is not called for. Then it might involve the state and state resources, but there has to be a presidential declaration for federal assets to become available.
So if there is, we were just having a talk by Sandy Jordan, who was talking about the full rip of the Cascadia Fault. So if we had a major disaster in the Pacific Northwest and communication, like after Katrina, just was flattened,
Yeah.
In that case, I was just wondering if they would just.
I think they would be forward-leaning. I think they would. I don't know if they would, wait for that kind of formality in case of that kind of magnitude. Yeah. Yes. Yes. You.
I know after the Christchurch earthquakes, they have developed a digital repository of world histories and lessons learned and that kind of information. Are you aware of anything similar for other events?
Yes, actually FEMA has a lessons learned website. And so it's actually quite comprehensive and it's been compiled. There is one little aspect to it that you have to go through a background check to get access to it. But it's not that difficult. And I think that there's a lot of good information on that. So, yes. Yeah. Yes.
What about school shootings?
Sure.
Is that considered a disaster?
It kind of brings up what's the difference between an emergency and a disaster. Do we have a head count and that determines it? I think also what about the psychosocial impact, like close by here in our own neighborhood, when there's maybe only a few victims, but the whole community is traumatized by it. So I think that in terms of definition, I think even if there are just a few casualties, I think it can be a disaster. Certainly when it's a mass shooting, it can be. And some interesting research just published in the Journal of Traumatic Stress on outcomes in survivors of mass shootings in the school. And very interesting. How many individuals were very distressed initially, but recovered within a few months. So if you have PTSD, the good news is that most people recover within a period of 6 months. If it goes after 6 months, a year or two, then I think it might be a lifelong type of disorder. Yes?
Can you talk about resiliency of events and how does that relate to what you just said about recovering?
What was the question?
Yeah, so the question had to do with resiliency and how does that relate to recovery. I think one definition of resilience is different than recovery. That is, that these individuals show very little initial reaction, maybe some distress, but it's situational. It would never reach the level of diagnosable mental disorder. But those individuals who do, a majority of those recover as well. But they consider resilience and recovery to be two separate types of trajectories. Yes?
So on that graph that you showed where people in certain categories of Iraqi war veterans, et cetera,
Yes.
had up to 20–25% incidence of PTSD, then there was the rest of those populations that had that coping capacity or that resilience, presumably. So that's the flip side of it, right?
Correct.
That's what she's
Yeah.
asking about.
Yes. So.
Is that a genetic or a psychological?
Well, certainly they've looked at a variety of things. There's one set of studies that they thought that it might have to do with brain structure. And so there is the area of the brain, the corpus callosum, that communicates between the right and left hemispheres and the hippocampus. And the idea that maybe individuals who are susceptible to PTSD, or maybe this erodes that area, and that's why they have PTSD. And then they found out that identical twins, one who'd been exposed and one who hadn't, had the same anatomical structure. So then they were looking at maybe it's a risk factor for PTSD. So they've looked at that as a risk factor, the vulnerable population. It seems that we don't know what all the factors are, but we're looking at what are called risk and protective factors. So that research is ongoing. So obviously, it's a focus of a lot of research. Yes?
Can you elaborate on your point about hospitals being fragile places or just protected?
Yes, they're very complicated and rely on things like water. Okay. What happens if the water main is not functioning? What happens if the housekeeping staff doesn't come to work? What happens if a significant fraction of the healthcare workers are sick with influenza, for instance? And certainly you don't want them to come to work. So I think that it's just a very complicated structure, and I think involves a number of pieces, any one of which could possibly bring that particular organization down. You know, it's not only hospitals, metro areas also very fragile. And I think if communication, if transportation grid is down, for instance, we're vulnerable, fragile. Yes?
Just wondering if in your research you've looked at the support networks of first responders, their families, the role that they play in supporting the first responders themselves, but also the impacts on the families of first responders.
We know very little about the impact on first responder families. I think trying to engage them in research is difficult. I think for one thing, the firefighters, so that's off limits. That's my family. But we do know a great deal about the importance of social support for firefighters and paramedics. By the way, it's not limited to them. Social support is probably the single most important factor in terms of resilience and recovery from post-traumatic stress disorder. We don't know of anything more important, and we don't know what the active ingredient of that is. But to say that one of the things I found in my research is firefighters who were married had half the rates of PTSD compared to their single counterparts. And it's interesting, you think, well, maybe they go home and they can talk about it, and they can have like group debriefing or something like that. No, they don't go home and talk about it. They want to go home and have that be completely separate and have it be a haven for them. So it's kind of interesting how we think about it and how social support might work. It also may be that if they wanted to talk about it, they could. We'd have someone that would listen. But the vast majority, the last thing they want to do is talk about a critical issue at home. Good questions. What else? Thank you very much.